He should have died on that frozen hell, but she wouldn't let him. She dragged him from the wreckage, claws hot against his frozen skin. What began as survival became war, and in the fire of battle, she made him hers. Surrender wasn't defeat. It was destiny. Imagine this. You're plummeting through a violet-streaked void, your ship a screaming wreck, about to smash into a rogue planet where the ice cuts like glass and the air burns your lungs. Your only hope, a 7-foot alien goddess with horns, claws, and a tail that could choke you or cuddle you depending on her mood. Her skin's white as starlight, her silk flows like liquid temptation, and her double pupil eyes see right through your soul. She's not here to save you. She's here to claim you. Welcome to Virith 9, where survival's a gamble, and the stakes are primal, raw, and hotter than the crash that strands you. This isn't just a story, it's a descent into beauty, danger, and the kind of bond that rewrites the stars. Stick around, because things are about to get wild. Love wild sci-fi with alien twists? Hit that subscribe button for alien whispers on YouTube. Don't miss a single whisper from the cosmos. Riley Crash, Maddox wasn't supposed to die today. At least that's what he told himself as his escape pod tore through the atmosphere of Virith 9, spinning like a drunk top flung by a pissed-off giant. The rusty Gambit, his patched-together salvage ship, had been a creaking bucket of bolts even on its best days. But when it grazed a derelict freighter's hull during a scavenging run, best days became a distant memory. The explosion was quick, too quick, leaving him with a split second to eject before the whole thing turned into a fireball. Now his pod's HUD screamed red. Hull integrity 12%. Oxygen reserves critical. Impact in 17 seconds. Well, Crash, he muttered, voice muffled by his helmet. You've officially outdone yourself. Death by glittery ice spikes, poetic as hell. He braced, gripping the straps, as the pod smashed into the surface with a bone-rattling crunch. Metal groaned, glass shattered, and Riley's world flipped upside down, literally. The pod skidded across a frozen plain, carving a trench through jagged crystal formations that sparkled like broken chandeliers under the eerie violet glow of a dying pulsar overhead. When the spinning stopped, Riley hung upside down, blood rushing to his head, his breath fogging the cracked visor. Still alive? That's a win, he rasped, kicking the hatch open. Cold hit him like a slap, sharp, biting, and laced with methane that stung his nose even through the suit's filters. He tumbled out, boots crunching in a snow that glittered with a faint electric hum. Around him stretched Virith 9's surface, a chaotic sprawl of methane, lakes bubbling with noxious steam, forests of razor-edged crystals pulsing with static, and glowing vines that slithered across the ground like they had opinions. The pulsar's light painted it all in shades of bruised purple and frost white, surreal and hostile. Riley checked his wrist display. Suit heater flickering, oxygen at 20%, no signal to ping for rescue. Perfect. Stranded on a disco ball from hell, he said, forcing a grin. He stumbled forward, aiming for anywhere that wasn't open ground, when a vine snapped up from the snow. It lashed his leg, slicing through his suit like paper. Warm blood trickled down his calf. Oh, come on, he yelped, kicking it off. Another lunged, grazing his arm. He bolted, adrenaline drowning the pain, muttering, At least I'll be a sparkly corpse. Gotta look good for the autopsy. The wind picked up, howling through the crystal forest, whipping snow into a blizzard of glass-sharp grains that battered his helmet. Visibility dropped to nothing. His HUD flashed temperature critical. He trudged on, knee-deep in powder, breath hitching as the cold clawed through his suit. Not dying here, he growled, more to the planet than himself. I've survived worse. Pirates, tax audits, that noodle joint on Rigel 7. But the humor felt thin, stretched tight over a growing panic. His legs buckled, and he sank into the snow, vision blurring. Okay, universe, you win. Just make it quick. Then he saw it, a dark shape through the haze, half hidden behind a ridge of ice-crusted rock. A cave, small, jagged, but promising still air and maybe a shred of warmth. Riley crawled, gloved hands clawing at the snow, dragging himself the last few meters. He tumbled inside, collapsing against a wall of warm stone. Geothermal, thank the stars. The temperature shift hit like a punch. Not cozy, but not instant death either. He yanked off his helmet, chest heaving, face flushed red from cold and exertion. See? Cockroaches of the galaxy, he panted, leaning back, eyes drifting shut. Peace lasted about 3 seconds. A low growl rumbled through the cave, deep, primal, vibrating the air. Riley's eyes snapped open. The darkness wasn't empty. Something shifted in the shadows, large and alive. Pale light from his suit's shoulder lamp caught a glint of shimmering white, skin, smooth as fresh snow, glowing faintly. Then 2 amber eyes blinked open, each with twin pupils that glowed like molten gold, locking onto him with an intensity that pinned him in place. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate, a figure straight out of fever dream. 7 feet tall, her body was a masterpiece of alien beauty. Curved obsidian horns swept back from her forehead, framing a face that was sharp yet soft, regal yet wild. Her skin was alabaster perfection, catching the light in a way that made it shimmer, and her silver hair flowed down her back like liquid starlight, sparking faintly with static. She wore a silk-like garment, translucent and shifting from pearl to violet, clinging to her hips and chest like it was poured over her. Pointed ears twitched atop her head, edged with delicate scales, and a cat-like tail swayed behind her, white-furred with a glowing indigo barb at the tip. Holy shit! Riley breathed, too stunned to move. She growled again, lips parting to reveal sharp teeth, her double-pupil eyes narrowing. One pupil dilating with curiosity, the other tightening in suspicion. Her tail flicked, the barb brushing his leg. A light, teasing graze that sent a jolt through him. Oh great, a sexy Grim Reaper, he managed, voice cracking. Do I get a last kiss before the stabbing? She didn't laugh, didn't even blink, just stalked closer, her silk rustling with each step. Up close, she smelled faintly of ozone and something sweet, like the air before a storm. Her claws flexed, long and retractable, as she crouched over him, sniffing the air. Then, without warning, she grabbed his shoulders, claws digging through his suit into his skin. Not deep, but firm. Riley yelped, "Okay, lady, personal space is a thing." Her hands slid down his chest, pressing hard, tearing the fabric further to check his wounds. Her skin was hot, impossibly hot, against the cold seeping into him, and the silk of her garment brushed his bare sternum as she leaned in. His heart slammed against his ribs, a mix of fear and something else, something stupid and primal, flooding his system. Her tail coiled around his thigh, the soft fur tickling, the bar pressing just above his hip, possessive and deliberate. He gasped, skin prickling. "You're gonna ruin me for rescue teams, you know that?" She huffed, a melodic sound that vibrated through his bones, her double pupils studying him up close, too close. Her breath washed over his neck, warm and tingling, and her claws lingered, scraping lightly down his arms as she assessed him. Riley swallowed hard, flustered and half-frozen, his humor barely holding. "If this is how I die, I'm filing a complaint with the universe," he muttered, but his eyes couldn't leave hers, those glowing, alien orbs pulling him in like a tractor beam. She didn't attack. Instead, she yanked him upright with one clawed hand, dragging him deeper into the cave. Her tail stayed wrapped around his leg, guiding him like a leash, and her silk-clad hip bumped his side with every step. Riley stumbled after her, breath ragged, muttering to himself, "Cockroaches, right? We adapt, even to whatever this is." Her ears twitched at his voice, and she tossed a glance back, mimicking his tone with a mocking grunt. He grinned despite himself, clutching his torn suit. Whatever she was, goddess, predator, or something in between, she hadn't killed him yet. That was a start. She shoved him against a glowing fungal wall, the warmth seeping into his back as she loomed over him again, her silk shimmering in the dim light. Riley fumbled with his emergency pack, pulling out duct tape to patch his suit, his hands shaking, not just from the cold. See? Humans, he said, taping a gash closed. We're stubborn as hell. She tilted her head, silver hair sparking, and tossed him a fungal pod, slimy, edible, glowing faintly. It splattered in his lap, and he laughed a raw, ridiculous sound. Dinner and a show. You're spoiling me, horn lady. Her tail flicked, brushing his arm this time, and she settled beside him, watching with those unnerving eyes as he chewed the pod. The cave hummed around them, geothermal heat, fungal light, and the distant screech of something mechanical echoing through the ice. Riley wiped his mouth, glancing at her. She didn't move, just stared, her silk shifting as she breathed. He leaned back, still catching his breath, the weight of her presence sinking in as the blizzard howled outside. Riley chewed the fungal pod, the slimy texture sliding down his throat like a dare he'd already lost. It tasted like damp socks and regret, but it was fuel, and he'd eaten worse on backwater stations. Beside him, Zara crouched, her amber double-pupil eyes glinting in the fungal glow, watching him with a mix of curiosity and something sharper, something that made his skin prickle under the torn suit. Her silk garment shimmered as she shifted, the fabric hugging her curves like it was alive, and her silver hair sparked faintly, floating in the cave's humid air. The geothermal warmth pulsed through the stone floor, a lifeline against the blizzard raging outside, but it was her presence, huge, alien, and way too close, that kept his pulse hammering. Gotta admit, he said, wiping slime from his chin, you've got the whole mysterious hot alien vibe nailed. Do all your guests get the VIP stare down? Or am I special? She didn't answer, just tilted her head, pointed ears twitching, and let out a low huff that vibrated the air. It wasn't hostile, more like she was mocking his chatter. Riley grinned, taping another rip in his suit. Yeah, laugh it up, horn lady. I'm a survivor. Cockroaches got nothing on me. Her tail flicked, the glowing indigo barb grazing his knee this time, deliberate and slow. The soft fur brushed his skin through the suit's gashes, sending a shiver up his leg that he tried, and failed to ignore. He glanced at her, catching the way one of her pupils dilated while the other stayed narrow, like she was sizing him up and teasing him all at once. Okay, that's a cheap move, he muttered, voice rougher than he meant it to be. She grunted again, louder, and tossed another pod into his lap. It splattered, oozing over his thigh. Spoiling me now, huh? Careful, I might stick around. The cave trembled faintly, a distant rumble, mechanical and wrong, cutting through the wind's howl. Riley froze mid-chew, his grin fading. Zara's ears pinned back, her tail stiffening as she rose to her full height, horns gleaming in the dim light. Her white skin caught the fungal glow, making her look like a statue carved from starlight, but her stance was all predator, tense, ready. That's not weather, Riley said, shoving the pod aside and scrambling up. His HUD flickered. Oxygen 18%. Heater output 40%. Something's out there, isn't it? She didn't look at him, just stared at the cave mouth, claws flexing, her silk rustling as her chest rose and fell faster. Riley grabbed his pack, fumbling for anything useful. Duct tape, a cracked flare gun, a nutrient bar half squashed from the crash. If it's pirates, I've got charm. If it's monsters, I've got, this. He waved the flare gun, its single shot rattling loose. Zara's tail lashed, the barb slicing through the air an inch from his arm, and she growled, a deep, resonant sound that shook his ribs. Right? You're the muscle. I'm the brains. Classic team-up. The rumble grew louder, a grinding screech echoing off the ice outside. Zara moved fast, shoving him back against the fungal wall with one clawed hand. Her strength was insane. His boots skidded on the stone, and he hit the wall hard enough to knock the breath out of him. Hey, easy, he gasped, but then she was on him, her body pressing close, pinning him there. Her silk-clad chest slid against his torn suit, smooth and hot, her curves molding to him like she was claiming every inch of space he had left. Her claws dug into his shoulders, not cutting but gripping tight, and her tail coiled around his waist, the fur soft but the barb pressing hard into his lower back, a jolt of heat and danger that made his breath catch. Her face hovered inches from his, amber eyes blazing, both pupils wide now, boring into him. Her breath washed over his jaw, warm and tingling with that ozone-sweet scent, and her silver hair sparked, brushing his cheek like static kisses. Riley's heart slammed against his ribs, a chaotic mix of fear and something dumber, something that burned low and reckless in his gut. "Okay," he rasped, voice cracking. "If this is your version of stay put, I'm not complaining, but maybe warn a guy." She didn't budge, just pressed harder, her smooth skin searing through the rips in his suit where her thighs pinned his hips. Her claws slid down his arms, slow and deliberate, scraping over his biceps with a pressure that teetered on the edge of pain, sending a shiver racing down his spine. Her tail tightened, the barb digging into his back, and he felt every inch of her heat bleeding into him, overwhelming, possessive, alive. He swallowed hard, mouth dry. "You're making survival way too interesting, you know that?" The screech outside sharpened, closer now, metal grinding against ice. Zara's ears flicked, and she pulled back just enough to glance at the cave mouth, her grip loosening but her tail staying firm around him. Riley sucked in a shaky breath, the sudden absence of her weight leaving him cold and flustered. "Whatever's out there," he said, adjusting his pack. "I'm guessing it's not here for tea. You got a plan? Or are we winging it?" She turned, her silk shimmering as she stalked to the cave's edge, peering into the blizzard. Her tail unwound from him, slow and reluctant, the barb trailing across his hip like a parting tease. Riley shook his head, muttering focus crash, dying still on the table. He joined her, flare gun in hand, squinting through the haze. The violet light of the pulsar barely pierced the snow, but something moved out there, a shadow, too angular, too deliberate to be natural. His HUD beeped. Oxygen 16%. Great. Low air, creepy noises, and a hot alien babysitter. Living the dream. Zara growled low, her claws tapping the stone, and pointed with one sharp finger toward a deeper tunnel branching off the cave. It was narrow, lined with glowing fungi that pulsed like a heartbeat, leading into darkness. "In there?" Riley asked, voice tight. "Looks cozy," assuming cozy means probably full of death. She didn't wait, just grabbed his arm, her claws sinking into his sleeve, and pulled him toward it. Her strength dragged him forward, his boots slipping on the slick floor, and he stumbled into her side, his shoulder brushing the silk over her ribs. It was smooth, warm, and way too distracting for a guy trying not to die. All right, I'm moving," he said, half laughing, half panicked. She shoved him ahead, her tail nudging his back, urging him faster. The tunnel swallowed them, the fungal light casting long shadows that danced across her white skin and sparking hair. Riley's breath fogged the air, his suit's heater whining as it struggled to keep up. The screech outside faded, muffled by stone, but the tension didn't. It hung thick between them, electric and unspoken. He glanced back at her, catching the way her double pupils glowed in the dimness, one tracking the path ahead, the other fixed on him. "You're not just keeping me alive, are you?" he said, quieter now, the humor softening into something raw. "You're stuck with me too, huh?" She didn't answer, just pushed him forward again, her claws brushing his neck this time, a fleeting touch that lingered like a promise. The tunnel curved downward, the air growing warmer, heavier, and Riley gripped the flare gun tighter, his other hand brushing the fungal wall for balance as they descended into whatever waited below. The tunnel twisted deeper into Virith 9's guts, the fungal glow painting Riley and Zara in shifting shades of green and gold. The air thickened, warm, damp, clinging to Riley's skin through the rips in his suit like a needy ghost. His boots slipped on the slick stone, each step a gamble against gravity, but Zara's clawed hand stayed firm on his arm, pulling him along with a strength that made his muscles ache in protest. Her silk garment shimmered in the dimness, catching the light like liquid starlight, and her silver hair sparked faintly, brushing his shoulder as they moved. That distant mechanical screech still echoed behind them, fainter now, but gnawing at the edges of his nerves. Gotta say, Riley panted, flare gun wobbling in his free hand. This is the weirdest date I've ever been on. No dinner, no movie, just creepy tunnels and a hot alien dragging me to who knows where. Zara's pointed ears twitched, her double pupil eyes flicking back to him. One glowing amber orb narrowing in annoyance, the other dilating with something softer. She growled low, a melodic rumble that vibrated through his chest and gave his arm a sharp tug. "Yeah, I'm moving," he muttered, grinning despite the burn in his lungs. "You're bossy for someone who doesn't talk." The tunnel widened suddenly, spilling them into a cavern vast enough to swallow a freighter hull. Bioluminescent vines draped from the ceiling, pulsing with faint electric blue, and a subterranean river cut through the center, its surface alive with glowing eels that darted like living sparks. Steam rose from the water, curling around jagged crystal stalagmites that hummed with static. Virith Nine's heartbeat laid bare. Riley stumbled to a stop, catching his breath, his HUD flickering. Oxygen 14%. Heater output 35%. "Okay, this is something," he said, voice echoing off the walls. Like a rave threw up on a cave painting. Zara released his arm, her claws scraping his sleeve as she stepped forward, scanning the cavern with a predator's focus. Her tail swayed, the indigo barb glowing brighter in the humid air, and her white skin gleamed under the eel light, smooth and flawless against the chaos around them. Riley rubbed his arm where her grip had been, the warmth lingering like a brand. "You know this place, don't you?" he asked, quieter now. She didn't turn, just pointed at the river with one claw, then motioned him to follow. "Lead on, Horn Lady. I'm just a guy with the duct tape and bad ideas." They skirted the river's edge, the eels snapping at the air as they passed, their electric zaps crackling faintly. Riley kept his flare gun raised, eyes darting between the shadows, but Zara moved like she owned the place, her silk rustling, her horns cutting the steam like a crown. The mechanical screech sounded again, sharper now, bouncing off the cavern walls. Riley froze. "That's closer," he said, voice tight. "Way too close." Zara's tail lashed, and she spun, shoving him toward a cluster of stalagmites. "Whoa, easy," he started, but then he saw it. A shadow scuttling across the ceiling, too fast, too angular, a spider-like drone with red sensors glowing like dying stars. "Shit," Riley hissed, ducking behind the crystals. Zara crouched beside him, her body pressing close, her silk-clad hip sliding against his side. Her heat bled through his suit, a stark contrast to the cold dread sinking into his gut. The drone skittered lower, its legs clicking against the stone, sensors sweeping the cavern. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. Zara's claws flexed, and she growled, a sound raw with memory, not just warning. She tapped her chest, then slashed a claw through the air, her double pupils blazing. "Yours," Riley guessed. "Your people's? Great. Killer Roomba knockoffs. My specialty." The drone paused, sensors locking onto the river, and Riley fumbled with his pack, pulling out the flare gun single shot. "One chance," he muttered, hands shaking. Zara's tail coiled around his leg, the soft fur brushing his calf, the barb pressing into his thigh, a steadying grip that made his pulse jump. "You're not helping my focus," he grumbled, but her eyes stayed on the drone, fierce and unyielding. He aimed, finger twitching on the trigger, when another screech split the air, then another. Two more drones dropped from the vines, legs gleaming with frost and scratches. "Oh, come on," Riley yelped, scrambling back. Zara surged forward, claws slashing at the nearest drone. Sparks flew as she tore into it, her tail whipping around to smack its sensors. Crunch. The thing staggered, but the others lunged, one skittering toward Riley. He fired the flare, a blinding streak of light slamming into its core. It erupted in a shower of sparks, collapsing in a heap, but the third drone pivoted, its claw slicing towards Zara's leg. She roared, dodging, but the tip grazed her thigh, dark blood streaking her white skin. Riley lunged, grabbing a loose stalagmite shard and swinging it like a bat. It cracked against the drone's leg, bending it, but the thing spun, pinning him to the ground. Its claw hovered over his chest, sensors glowing red, and Riley's breath caught. Oxygen 12%, his HUD screaming. Then Zara was there, her horns lowered, slamming into the drone with her full weight. They tumbled across the stone, her claws ripping into its shell, wires spilling like guts. It twitched once and went still. She stood, panting, blood dripping down her leg, her silk torn at the thigh, clinging wetly to her skin. Riley pushed himself up, chest heaving, staring at her. "You're insane," he said, half laughing, half awed. "And I mean that as a compliment." She limped toward him, her tail dragging slightly, and shoved him back against the stalagmite cluster. Not gentle, but not hostile either. Her claws gripped his shoulders, pinning him there, and she leaned in, her face inches from his, amber eyes wild with adrenaline. Her silk pressed against his chest, damp and warm, sliding over his torn suit as her curves molded to him. Her claws dug into his arms, hard enough to bruise, and her tail snaked up his side, the barb pressing into his ribs, a sharp, possessive jab that made his breath hitch. Her smooth skin brushed his neck, searing hot, and her silver hair sparked, grazing his jaw like a live wire. Riley's heart slammed against his ribs, a reckless heat flooding him as her breath, ozone sweet and ragged, washed over his lips. "Okay," he rasped, voice cracking. "If this is your way of saying, 'You're welcome,' I'm ruined for thank you notes." She growled, low and throaty, her double pupils locking onto his, one dilated with something fierce, the other narrowing with intent. Her claws slid down his chest, slow and deliberate, scraping over his sternum through the fabric, sending a shiver racing through him that he couldn't hide. Her tail tightened, the fur soft against his hip, the barb digging harder, teetering on the edge of pain and thrill. For a heartbeat, he thought she might close the gap, her lips hovering so close he could feel their heat, but she pulled back, her grip easing, leaving him flushed and breathless. "Tease," he muttered, shaking his head, but his grin was shaky raw. Zara huffed, stepping away to inspect the wrecked drones, her tail flicking with annoyance. Riley slumped against the stalagmite, rubbing his chest where her claws had been. "Humans don't go quietly," he said, more to himself than her. "And apparently, neither do you." He glanced at his HUD, oxygen 11%. Time was bleeding out fast, and those drones weren't random. They were hunting. Zara knelt by the river, dipping her clawed hand into the water, washing the blood from her leg. The eels darted away, sensing her, and she stood, her silk clinging to her thigh where the tear exposed more of her smooth white skin. She pointed downstream, where the cavern narrowed into another tunnel, darker and tighter than the last. "More running?" Riley asked, hauling his pack over his shoulder. "Guess I'm earning my keep." She nodded once, sharp and certain, and started moving, her horns cutting through the steam. Riley followed, his boots splashing in shallow puddles, the flare guns empty, casing rattling in his hand. The cavern's hum grew fainter behind them, replaced by the river's soft rush and the distant drip of water on stone. Zara's tail swayed ahead, the barb glowing like a beacon, and Riley kept his eyes on it, his mind spinning with questions about her, about those drones, about why the hell he wasn't more scared. The tunnel loomed closer, swallowing the light, and he adjusted his pack, muttering, "Cockroaches and goddesses. Weirdest team in the galaxy." The tunnel tightened around them like a fist, the glowing river narrowing to a shimmering thread that snaked alongside their path. Riley's boots splashed through shallow pools, the water cold even through his suit, while Zara moved ahead, her silk-clad form cutting through the steam with predatory grace. Her silver hair sparked faintly, illuminating the claustrophobic walls, jagged crystal and fungal growths pulsing in sync with some unseen rhythm. The air grew heavier, thick with moisture and the faint tang of methane, pressing against Riley's lungs. His HUD flickered, oxygen 10%, heater output 30%. Time was a noose, tightening with every step, But Zara's tail swayed ahead, the glowing barb a lifeline he couldn't look away from. Cockroaches and goddesses, he muttered, adjusting his pack. Sounds like a bad hollow flick, but I'm still here for it. His voice echoed, a thin thread of bravado against the tunnel's oppressive silence. Zara's pointed ears twitched, and she glanced back, her double-pupil eyes glinting, one amber orb wide with curiosity, the other narrowed with focus. She grunted, a melodic sound that rippled through the air, and slowed her pace, letting him catch up. "What, you like my commentary now?" he asked, grinning. "Stick around, I got plenty." She didn't answer, just brushed her clawed hand against his arm, guiding him around sharp bend. Her touch lingered, warm through the suit's tears, and Riley's grin faltered, a flicker of something deeper stirring in his chest. The tunnel opened into a smaller chamber, a hollowed-out pocket where the river pooled into a glowing basin. Electric eels darted beneath the surface, their light casting wild shadows across the walls, etched with faint, spiraling symbols that looked too deliberate to be natural. Zara stopped, her tail curling slightly, and knelt by the water, her silk clinging to her thighs as she dipped her claws in. Riley slumped against a crystal outcrop, catching his breath. "Nice spot," he said, voice rough. "If we're not running from killer drones, I'd call it romantic. Glowy fish, steamy vibes, the works." Zara's ears flicked, and she stood, shaking water from her claws. Her silk shifted, the tear at her thigh exposing more of her smooth white skin, streaked faintly with dried blood. She limped slightly, favoring her injured leg, and Riley's humor faded. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, stepping closer. "That drone got you good back there." She growled softly, not hostile, just dismissive, and turned to the wall, tracing one of the symbols with a claw. It was a spiral, jagged at the edges like the one she'd slashed in the air before. Riley watched, his HUD beeping faintly. "Oxygen 9%. Your people stuff, right?" he guessed, voice quieter. "What's it say?" "Welcome to hell. Population us." She didn't look at him, just kept tracing, her tail swaying slow and heavy, the barb dimming. Something in her posture, shoulders tight, horns lowered, hit him harder than the cold ever could. He stepped beside her, close enough to feel her heat cutting through the damp air. "Look," he said, softer now, "I'm no expert on alien cave art, but you're not just some random badass, are you? This is personal." Her claws paused, and she turned her head, those glowing eyes locking onto his. Both pupils dilated this time, wide and unguarded, and she tapped the symbol again. Then her chest, then the ground beneath them. A low hum escaped her throat, mournful and deep, vibrating through the stone. Riley swallowed, his throat tight. "Your family," he said, piecing it together. "They were here, and those drones, they took them." She nodded once, sharp and slow, her tail curling around her own leg like a shield. He exhaled, running a hand through his sweaty hair. "Yeah, I get that. Not the killer robot part, but the losing people part. I ran from Earth young. Family was a mess, no one worth sticking for. Been dodging loneliness ever since." He forced a grin, lopsided and raw. "Guess we're both strays now, huh?" Zara tilted her head, her silver hair brushing his arm, sparking faintly against his skin. She stepped closer, her silk rustling, and placed a clawed hand on his chest, gentle this time, not pinning, just feeling. Her heat seeped through his suit, steady and alive, and Riley's breath hitched, his hand hovering over hers. "You're gonna make me soft, horn lady," he muttered, voice cracking. "Not fair." She huffed, mimicking his tone again, and her tail nudged his leg, a playful flick that broke the weight between them. The chamber trembled, a faint rumble rolling through the stone. Riley tensed, glancing at the tunnel behind them. "That's not good," he said, grabbing his pack. Zara's ears pinned back, and she sniffed the air, her claws flexing. The rumble grew, a grinding screech echoing closer, metal on crystal, deliberate and relentless. "More drones?" Riley asked, voice tight. She nodded, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the river. "Wait," he started, but she was already wading in, the glowing water lapping at her thighs, her silk clinging wetly to her curves. Riley followed, the cold biting through his boots, eels zapping at his legs. "This is insane," he muttered, splashing after her. The water reached his waist, then his chest, and Zara turned, her horns glinting in the eel light. She grabbed his shoulders, claws digging in, and yanked him against her, her body a wall of heat in the freezing current. Her silk pressed against his chest, slick and warm, sliding over his torn suit as her curves molded to him. Hard muscle under smooth skin, overwhelming and alive. Her tail coiled around his waist, the barb pressing into his lower back, sharp and possessive, sending a jolt through him that drowned the cold. Her face hovered close, steam curling between them, her breath hot on his jaw, ozone sweet and ragged. Her claws slid down his arms, gripping his biceps with a slow, deliberate pressure, scraping through the fabric until he felt the sting on his skin. Riley's pulse raced, a reckless heat flooding his gut as her smooth thighs pressed against his, pinning him in the water. Her silver hair sparked, brushing his neck, and her double pupils burned into him, one wide with urgency, the other narrow with something fiercer. "You're going to kill me before the drones do," he rasped, voice thick, "and I'm not even mad about it." She growled, low and resonant, the sound humming through his bones, and her tail tightened, the fur soft against his hip, the barb digging harder, a thrill teetering on the edge of danger. Her silk-clad chest slid against him, wet and searing, and for a heartbeat, he thought she might drag him under, not to drown, but to claim. Then the screech split the air again, closer, and she pulled back, her grip easing but her tail lingering, brushing his thigh as she turned downstream. Riley sucked in a shaky breath, flushed and reeling. "Tease," he muttered, shaking his head, but his grin was wild, untamed. She pointed ahead, where the river curved into a darker tunnel, the water rushing faster. "Swimming it is," Riley said, adjusting his pack. "Hope those eels don't get too friendly." Zara waded deeper, her silk floating around her like a second skin, and Riley followed, the current tugging at his legs. The screech echoed behind them, metal claws clicking against stone, and he glanced back, seeing shadows flicker at the chamber's edge. "Humans don't go quietly," he muttered, gripping the empty flare gun like a talisman. "Neither do you." Zara's tail flicked, the barb glowing brighter, and she reached back, her claws brushing his wrist, a fleeting touch that steadied him. The river pulled them forward, the tunnel swallowing the light, and Riley kicked against the current, his suit's heater whining as it flickered lower. The drone's screeches faded, muffled by water and stone, but the tension didn't. It coiled tighter, a thread of trust, and something raw weaving between them as they moved deeper in Avirith Nine's heart. The walls closed in, the eels darted around his boots, and Zara's horns gleamed ahead, cutting through the dark like a promise he couldn't name. The river's current dragged Riley forward, the glowing eels snapping at his boots as he kicked against the pole. Water sloshed into his suit through the tears, icy and biting, but Zara's horns gleamed ahead, cutting through the tunnel's darkness like a beacon. Her silk floated around her, clinging wetly to her white skin, and her silver hair sparked, trailing behind her like a comet's tail. The tunnel walls pressed closer, crystal edges scraping his shoulders, and his HUD flickered. Oxygen 8%. Heater output 25%. His lungs burned, each breath shallower than the last, but Zara's tail flicked back, the glowing barb brushing his leg, a silent nudge to keep going. Swimming with electric fish in a death trap, Riley muttered, voice hoarse. Add that to the resume. Right under crashed on glitter hell. Zara's pointed ears twitched, and she glanced back, her double pupil eyes glowing, one amber orb wide with urgency, the other narrow with focus. She growled low, a melodic hum that cut through the water's rush, and reached back, her claws grazing his wrist again. "Yeah, I'm still here," he said, forcing a grin. "Not ditching you yet, Horn Lady." The tunnel spat them into a jagged chasm, the river spilling over a ledge into a deep, steaming pool below. Crystal canyons towered around them, their surfaces pulsing with static, and methane geysers erupted in the distance, spewing scalding vapor that hissed against the ice. Riley surfaced, gasping, the cold water dragging at his pack. Zara hauled herself onto a rocky shelf, her silk dripping, clinging to her curves like a second skin. She turned, claws outstretched, and yanked him up beside her, her strength lifting him like he weighed nothing. His boots slipped on the wet stone, and he collapsed against her, his chest slamming into her silk-clad ribs. Her heat hit him like a wave, searing through the chill, and her tail coiled around his thigh, the soft fur brushing his skin, the barb pressing hard into his hip, a jolt that made his breath catch. "Okay," he rasped, half laughing. "You're my lifeguard now? I'm not complaining." She huffed, her breath warm on his neck, and steadied him with a clawed hand on his shoulder, her double pupils scanning the chasm. The air trembled, a faint rumble, then a screech, metal grinding against crystal, echoing from above. Riley's grin faded. "They're back," he said, voice tight. Zara's ears pinned back, and she shoved him toward a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, her claws scraping his arm. He stumbled in, the space barely wide enough for his shoulders, and she followed, her body pressing close behind. The drones, 3 of them now, dropped into the chasm, spider-like legs gleaming with frost, red sensors sweeping the pool. "Persistent bastards," Riley muttered, peering out. "We can't stay here," he said, shifting to stand. Zara gripped his arm, her claws light but firm, and pulled herself up beside him, her silk dripping, her tail swaying slow and stubborn. They limped toward a shadowed crevice higher up the canyon, Riley's leg dragging, Zara's side bleeding. The river rushed below, eels darting in the glow, and the air hummed with static. Virith, 9 alive and unforgiving. Riley adjusted his pack, the empty flare gun rattling inside, and muttered, "Cockroaches don't quit, right? Neither do goddesses." Zara's ears flicked, and she pressed her shoulder against his, her heat a quiet anchor as they climbed, the chasm's echoes fading behind them into the dark. The crevice spat Riley and Zara into a sloping tunnel, the air thick with frost and the faint hum of something ancient. Riley's leg throbbed with every step, a dull ache pulsing from where the rock had pinned him, but Zara's shoulder pressed against his, her heat a lifeline cutting through the cold. Her silk clung to her white skin, tattered and blood-streaked, dripping from their swim, and her silver hair sparked faintly, brushing his arm as they moved. His HUD flickered. Oxygen 4%. Heater output 20%. The numbers were a death knell, but Zara's tail swayed ahead, the glowing barb steady, pulling him forward like a thread he couldn't let snap. "Cockroaches don't quit," Riley muttered, voice raw. "And goddesses don't either, right?" Zara's pointed ears flicked, and she glanced back, her double pupil eyes glowing, one amber orb soft with trust, the other sharp with resolve. She growled low, a melodic hum that steadied his ragged breathing, and nudged him with her horn, a gentle bump that felt more like a promise than a push. "Yeah, I'm still here," he said, forcing a grin. "You're stuck with me, horn lady." The tunnel dipped sharply, the walls widening into a cavernous expanse that stole Riley's breath, not from the cold, but from the sight. The Sentinel Hive loomed before them, a fortress of ice and metal fused into Virith 9's core. Violet energy pulsed through jagged spires, illuminating dormant sentinel husks, spider-like shells lining the walls, their red sensors dark and lifeless. A central core towered in the distance, a massive cylinder humming with corrupted light, its surface etched with the same spiraling symbol Zara had traced before. The air buzzed with static, heavy with the weight of a lost world. "Holy shit," Riley whispered, his voice echoing. "This isn't just a hideout, it's a damn city." Zara's tail stiffened, and she stepped forward, her claws tapping the frost-crusted floor. Her silk rustled, clinging to her thighs, and her white skin caught the violet glow, making her look like a ghost of this place, haunting, fierce, alive. Riley limped after her, his pack rattling, the empty flare gun a useless comfort in his hand. "Your people built this, didn't they?" he asked, quieter now. "And those drones, they turned on you?" She nodded once, slow and heavy, her horns lowered as she approached a raised platform near the core. Her claws brushed its surface, and it flared to life, blue light rippling under her touch, symbols glowing brighter. Riley's HUD beeped. Oxygen 3%. He staggered closer, peering at the panel. "Okay, genius time," he muttered, digging into his pack for salvage pod parts. Wires, a cracked battery, a busted comm unit. Humans break shit since forever. Let's fix something for once. Zara watched, her double pupils tracking his hands as he jury-rigged a connection, splicing wires into the platform's ports. Sparks flew, and the panel hummed louder, a hollow display flickering to life. Maps, logs, garbled alien text scrolling past. "Jackpot," Riley said, grinning. "Now let's shut these bastards down." He tapped the screen, filtering through data, his fingers trembling from cold and adrenaline. Zara's tail nudged his leg, the soft fur brushing his calf, steadying him, and he glanced at her. "Teamwork makes the dream work, huh?" The logs confirmed it. Her people, the Virak, had built the Sentinels as guardians, powered by this core. A glitch, a corrupted directive, turned them genocidal, purging everything they'd sworn to protect. "They were supposed to save you," Riley said, voice tight, "and they killed you instead. That's messed up." Zara's claws flexed, and she growled, a sound raw with grief, not anger. She tapped the screen, then her chest, then him, her eyes blazing. "Yeah," he said, softer now, "we're rewriting this story, babe. No more running." The core pulsed faster, a warning hum vibrating the floor, and Riley's HUD flashed. Oxygen 2%. "Time's up," he muttered, hacking deeper into the system. Zara prowled the platform, her silk shimmering, her tail lashing as she scanned the husks. Waiting, guarding. Riley's fingers flew, rerouting power when a shadow moved above. A screech split the air, metal claws clicking, and a sentinel dropped from the ceiling. Bigger, sleeker, its sensors glowing red with purpose. "Oh, come on!" Riley yelped, ducking as it lunged. Zara roared, her horns lowered, and slammed into it, her claws slashing its shell. Sparks flew, her tail whipping around to smack its legs, but it was fast, too fast. It pinned her against the platform, a claw grazing her arm, fresh blood streaking her silk. Riley scrambled up, grabbing a loose cable from the panel and jamming it into the drone's core. It sparked, staggering back, but more screeches echoed. Two more sentinels skittering from the walls, their sensors locking on. "We're screwed," Riley muttered, voice shaking, but Zara's growl cut through, defiant, unyielding. She shoved him behind her, her body a shield, and faced the drones, her silk torn at the shoulder, her white skin gleaming with sweat and blood. Riley's hand shook as he worked the panel, rerouting power to overload the core. "Hold 'em off," he said, voice raw. "I've got this." Zara's tail lashed, and she charged, tearing into the nearest drone with a fury that shook the hive. Riley's HUD beeped. Oxygen 1%. His vision blurred, but he kept going, fingers numb, muttering, "Humans don't quit. Neither do you." The core whined, energy spiking, and Riley slammed the final command. A pulse rocked the platform, frying one drone mid-strike, but the third lunged, pinning Zara to the floor. Its claw hovered over her chest, and Riley's heart stopped. "No," he shouted, lunging forward. She roared, twisting free, and grabbed his arms, yanking him against her. Her silk pressed against his chest, slick with sweat and blood, sliding over his torn suit as her curves molded to him. Hard muscle and smooth skin, a wall of heat against the cold creeping in. Her claws dug into his shoulders, bruising deep, and her tail coiled around his waist, the barb pressing into his lower back, a sharp, possessive jab that made his breath hitch. Her thighs locked against his hips, pinning him close, and her silver hair sparked, dripping wet, brushing his neck like a live wire. Her breath washed over his jaw, ozone sweet and desperate, her double pupils blazing, both wide with a fierce, unspoken vow. Riley's pulse raced, a reckless heat flooding him as her claws slid down his arms, gripping his biceps with a slow, searing pressure that teetered on the edge of pain and thrill. "You're not dying on me," he rasped, voice cracking. "Not after all this." She growled, low and resonant, the sound humming through his bones, and her tail tightened, the fur soft against his side, the barb digging harder, a jolt that made his skin burn with something wild. Her silk-clad chest pressed harder, hot and slick, molding to him like she was staking a claim against the hive itself. Her lips hovered so close he could feel their heat, her horns framing her face like a crown of defiance. And for a heartbeat, he thought she might pull him into her, not with force, but with everything she had left. Then the drone screeched again, lunging, and she shoved him back, spinning to meet it with claws bared. Riley stumbled to the panel, his hands shaking as he rerouted the last surge. "Come on, you bastard," he muttered, slamming the controls. The core pulsed, a wave of violet light rippling out, and the drone staggered, collapsing mid-strike. Zara slumped, panting, her silk dripping, her side bleeding fresh. Riley dropped beside her, his HUD dark, oxygen gone, his breath shallow gasps. "We're not done," he said, voice faint, grabbing her arm. She leaned into him, her heat a fading anchor, and they staggered toward the core, the hive's hum softening as the light flickered around them. Riley's legs buckled as he staggered toward the Sentinel hive's core, the violet light pulsing erratically around them. His HUD was dead, oxygen gone, heater a faint whine against the frost creeping into his bones. Each breath was a shallow rasp, his vision blurring at the edges, but Zara's arm stayed locked around his, her claws digging into his sleeve, pulling him forward. Her silk clung to her white skin, torn and blood-soaked, dripping onto the ice-metal floor, and her silver hair sparked weakly, trailing behind her like a fading storm. Her tail dragged, the glowing barb dim, but her heat, fierce, stubborn, bled into him, keeping the dark at bay. "Almost there," Riley croaked, voice barely a whisper. "Cockroaches don't quit, right?" Zara's double-pupil eyes flicked to him, one amber orb soft with exhaustion, the other blazing with defiance. She growled low, a melodic hum that vibrated through his chest, and nudged him with her horn, a shaky push that said keep going. "Yeah," he muttered, forcing a grin. "You're the real badass here." The core loomed closer, its corrupted hum shaking the hive, dormant sentinel husks twitching along the walls. Riley's hand brushed its surface, cold, slick with frost, and he fumbled with the salvage battery, wires trembling in his numb fingers. "One last trick," he said, splicing them into a port. "EMP from their own juice. Poetic, huh?" Zara leaned against him, her shoulder pressing into his, her silk rustling faintly as she watched the shadows. A screech split the air, louder, deeper, and the floor quaked. Riley's head snapped up. A massive sentinel titan emerged from the core's base, its legs unfolding like a nightmare, sensors glowing red with malice. It dwarfed the others, a relic of Virak vengeance gone wrong, and its claws slashed the air, aiming for Zura. She roared, shoving Riley aside, and charged, her horns lowered, silk tearing further as she slammed into it. Sparks flew, her claws raking its shell, but it swatted her back, pinning her against a spire. Her tail lashed, the barb cracking a leg, but blood streaked her side. Fresh, dark, too much. "No!" Riley shouted, scrambling up, his legs screaming in protest. "This is for your family, Zura." He slammed the battery into the core, twisting the wires tight. The hum spiked, a deafening whine, and he hit the override. A violet pulse erupted, rippling through the hive. The titan staggered, circuits frying, and collapsed in a heap, inches from Zara. The smaller husks sparked and fell silent, the core's light dimming to a soft glow. Riley's suit shorted, the last of its power gone, and he dropped to his knees, gasping, the air thin and useless in his lungs. Zara crawled free, her silk dripping, her white skin streaked with blood and sweat. She grabbed him, hauling him against her, her claws digging into his shoulders, not gentle but desperate, her body pressed over his, shielding him as the hive trembled, debris clattering around them. Her silk slid against his torn suit, slick and hot, molding to his chest as her curves locked against him. Hard muscle and smooth skin, a wall of heat against the cold stealing his breath. Her tail coiled around his thigh, the barb pressing into his hip, a sharp, possessive jab that jolted through him, raw and alive. Her face hovered close, her breath ragged on his neck, ozone sweet and fierce, her silver hair sparking, dripping wet, brushing his jaw like a live wire. Her claws slid down his arms, gripping his biceps with a slow, bruising pressure, scraping through the fabric until his skin burned under her touch. Riley's pulse raced, a reckless heat flooding his gut as her thighs pressed against his, pinning him to the floor. Her double pupils blazed, both wide with a wild, unspoken vow, and her lips brushed his jaw, soft, hot, a fleeting claim that made his chest tighten. "We did it," he rasped, voice breaking. "You crazy goddess." She growled, low and throaty, the sound humming through his bones, and her tail tightened, the fur soft against his side, the barb digging harder, a thrill teetering on feral. Her silk-clad chest pressed closer, slick and searing, molding to him like she was staking him to this moment, this victory. Her horns framed her face, gleaming with defiance, and for a heartbeat, he thought she might pull him into her, not with force, but with everything she'd fought for. Then she eased back, her grip softening, her breath slowing as she cradled him, her heat a fading shield against the dark. Riley sucked in a shaky breath, his vision clearing as the hive's air shifted, warmer, cleaner, the core's pulse stabilizing. He glanced at Zara, her blood-streaked silk clinging to her eyes softening. "Guess we're not dead," he muttered, half laughing, "and you're still ruining me for rescue teams." She huffed, mimicking his tone, and nudged his jaw with her horn again, a tender bump that hit him deeper than the crash ever had. They stumbled out of the hive, leaning on each other, the ice cracking underfoot as geothermal heat spread, melting frost into shimmering pools. Virith, 9 was thawing, methane lakes bubbling, crystal forests humming softer, the pulsar's violet light bathing it all in a new dawn. Riley limped to a cave overlooking a glowing lake, collapsing against the warm stone, and Zara settled beside him, her silk drying in the breeze, her tail curling loosely around his leg. "Planetary landscaper," he quipped, voice raw but light. "New gig for me." She tilted her head, her double pupils glowing, one wide with peace, the other narrow with pride, and pressed her shoulder against his, her heat steady now, not fading. Riley reached out, brushing her horn with his fingers, tracing its curve gently. "Family's wherever you are," he said, quieter, his voice thick with something real. She growled softly, a melodic hum, and leaned into him, her lips brushing his temple, a fleeting, fierce promise. He kissed her horn, slow and deliberate, her smooth cheek grazing his lips, and her tail tightened around his leg, the barb resting still, a quiet claim. The lake shimmered below, eels darting in its depths, and the air warmed, carrying the faint scent of ozone and life. Riley adjusted his pack, the empty flare gun rattling inside, and pulled out a cracked nutrient bar, splitting it with her. "Cockroaches and goddesses," he muttered, chewing, "best damn team in the galaxy." Zara took the piece, her claws brushing his hand, and they sat there, shoulder to shoulder, the planet breathing around them, rebuilt, reclaimed theirs. Her silver hair sparked faintly in the breeze, and Riley leaned back, his grin lopsided, watching the horizon shift as Virith, 9 woke up beneath their stubborn spark.